The Everett Estate glowed with chandeliers that night, its grand ballroom alive with music, crystal glasses clinking, and the murmurs of Charleston's elite. It was supposed to be another flawless evening hosted by the Everett family, where polished shoes gleamed against marble floors, and women glided in gowns worth more than an ordinary family savings. Yet beneath the brilliance, tension always lingered. In this house, appearances were as fragile as glass. Grace Miller moved quietly between the tables, balancing a tray of wine glasses with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. She wore the standard black and white uniform, pressed but simple, her only adornment the silver chain at her neck. A small pendant, her late mother's, rested just above her collar. She often touched it before entering the hall, as if reminding herself she carried something of worth, even when surrounded by wealth that did not belong to her. Daniel Everett, heir to the Everett fortune, stood near the stage, laughing politely with investors. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored suit, he looked every bit the young man bred to command rooms like this. His mother, Margaret Everett, drifted nearby in a gown of midnight silk, her presence commanding, her smile as sharp as a blade. At her side was Vivian Caldwell, ever the socialite, watching with calculating eyes. The music swelled as Grace stepped behind one of the long banquet tables. A guest brushed past too quickly and her tray tipped. Only a few drops of red wine escaped the glass, splashing against the hem of Margaret's silk gown. It was hardly noticeable, but in that instant silence seemed to ripple through the air. Margaret froze, looking down at the stain as though it were acid eating through her dignity. Gasps followed when she turned, her face cold with fury. "Do you know what you've done?" Her voice cut through the orchestra like a blade. Grace's cheeks flushed crimson. She stammered, "I'm so sorry, ma'am. It was an accident." Before she could finish, Margaret's hand shot out, seizing the collar of Grace's uniform. In one vicious tug, the seam ripped open, fabric tearing under her grip. The sound of it echoed like a slap across the marble hall. Grace staggered back, clutching the edges of her torn blouse, her breath catching as humiliation swept over her. Murmurs erupted among the guests, some covering their mouths in shock, others leaning forward to witness the spectacle. Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she fought to hold them back. The pendant at her throat glinted under the lights as if reminding her to stand tall. Margaret raised her chin, her voice ringing through the hall. "Let this be a lesson. Uniforms do not excuse incompetence." And then Daniel moved. He stepped forward from the crowd, his voice steady yet laced with anger. "Mother!" The single word cracked against the silence. Every head turned. His eyes blazed as he looked at the woman who had raised him, then at Grace, trembling yet unbroken. He shrugged off his jacket and crossed the space between them. With deliberate care, he draped the jacket over Grace's shoulders, shielding her from the stares that cut like knives. The warmth of the fabric wrapped around her, but it was his words that shook the room. "You just insulted a human being," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "This uniform doesn't diminish her worth, but your actions just diminished yours." The orchestra faltered to a halt. Guests exchanged astonished glances. Some whispered, others nodded in subdued approval. Grace's lips parted, but no words came. She stood motionless, Daniel's jacket hiding her torn blouse, her pendant pressing against her skin like a heartbeat. For the first time, she felt that someone saw her not as a servant, but as a person. Margaret's face stiffened, pride wrestling with the sting of public shame. Vivian leaned close, whispering something into her ear, but the damage was already done. Daniel remained at Grace's side, tall and unyielding, as if daring anyone to add to her humiliation. Then, from the far edge of the hall, a camera flashed. A journalist, invited to cover the gala, had caught the scene in a single, damning image. The matriarch's hand still frozen mid-air, the torn fabric, and the young heir shielding the waitress with his own coat. Another flash followed, then another. What began as a moment of fury had turned into a scandal that would ripple far beyond the estate's walls. Grace lowered her gaze, heart pounding, uncertain whether to run or stand firm. The hall buzzed like a hive disturbed, but Daniel's presence beside her anchored her feet to the ground. Whatever came after this night, she knew nothing would ever be the same. And in Charleston, where whispers traveled faster than the tide, the story had already begun its journey. When the last car rolled past the iron gates and the orchestra cases snapped shut, the Everett Estate went quiet in the way storms go quiet. Heavy, waiting. Lamps burned low in Margaret's private sitting room, throwing soft puddles of light across old portraits and polished walnut. The smell of gardenias drifted in from the veranda, sweet enough to sting. Margaret sat very straight on the settee, fingers smoothing an invisible crease on her silk skirt. The tiny splash of wine had been cleaned, yet she stared at the fabric as if the stain still glared back. Vivian Caldwell slipped in without knocking, closing the door with a well-bred hush. She set her clutch on the console, a smile already where others might put sympathy. "You held the room until the end," Vivian said lightly, settling across from her. "That counts for something." "Counts for nothing," Margaret answered. Her voice was calm, the kind of calm that leaves frost on a glass. "My son chose a stranger over his own mother in front of half this city." Vivian tilted her head. "He chose a gesture. People do foolish things when a camera is pointed at them." Margaret's eyes flashed. "He put his coat on her." She said it as though naming a betrayal older than memory. "In this house, at my event." Vivian crossed one leg over the other. "Then we removed the temptation." Margaret turned, caught between offense and relief that someone would say aloud what she herself could not yet shape into words. "And how do you propose we do that? Fire her? She'll become a martyr, and he will chase her all the faster." "Not fire," Vivian murmured. "Discredit. Seeds, Margaret. You don't cut down an oak, you starve it of water." The clock on the mantel ticked, slow and proper. Margaret lifted a crystal glass and set it down again, untouched. "Go on." "People already whisper," Vivian said. "They saw the girl stand as if she belonged among the chandeliers. Very composed for a waitress. Almost practiced. We let that idea grow. Ambitious. Calculated. We never use ugly words. We let other tongues do it for us." Margaret's mouth was a straight line. "I won't have lies attached to our name." "They won't be lies," Vivian replied smoothly. "They'll be impressions. A neighbor noticed her around the back steps too often. A board member heard she lingers near the study. A caterer claims she's friendly with certain men. No one accuses, no one can point to a source, but by the time Daniel tries to defend her, he'll be defending smoke, and smoke always suggests fire." It looked toward the window where the lawn fell away into shadow. "He's young. He mistakes defiance for character." "Then we help him see," Vivian leaned forward. "We encourage distance. We make proximity feel dangerous. A few calls to the society page, a luncheon where the right comment is overheard, a trustee who worries about Daniel's judgment. You know these people better than anyone." A soft knock broke the room's stillness. Daniel stood in the doorway, jacketless now, bow tie loosened, fatigue blunt in his face. For a heartbeat, the three simply regarded one another, the air thick with what had happened and what had not yet happened. "Mother," he said quietly, "I'll speak to the staff about what took place. No one should be treated like that in our home." Margaret rose, every inch the matriarch. And a son should not shame his mother in hers. He took the rebuke, jaw tight. It wasn't about shame, it was about decency. "That girl is a guest in this house only by way of a uniform," Margaret replied. "You made her more." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "People are more than clothes," his voice gentled. "Rest. We'll talk in the morning." He left as he had come, not waiting for permission. Vivian watched the doorway close. "You see?" she said softly. He's halfway gone. No, Margaret said. She sat again, slow as a verdict. He is my son. The words steadied her posture, put steel back under silk. And she? Margaret paused, as if choosing a word too clean for how she felt. She will not drag this family into spectacle. Vivian's smile was small. Then we begin at once. They planned without raising their voices. Names were spoken with the care one gives china. Mrs. Ashby at the museum, Judge Harrell's wife, the editor who owed 3 favors, the club secretary who placed seating charts like chess pieces. Vivian mapped slender paths through drawing rooms and benefit committees where a comment could arrive on a silver tray and be digested as if it were food. We don't say she's chasing him, Vivian explained. We wonder if she's out of her depth. We don't call her shameless. We admire her nerves. And always we worry for Daniel. That way, when he defends her, he looks unreasonable. Margaret listened, eyes level. The room seemed to lean in with them. The portraits, the clock, the quiet rug underfoot. Somewhere outside, a nightbird called. She pictured the pendant at the girl's throat, bright, as if it had a right to shine in her ballroom, and felt an old ache she would not name. My father built this house, Margaret said at last. My husband kept it from being swallowed by men who smiled at our table and left knives under the linen. I carried this name through grief and winter and the kind of loneliness money can't sweeten. She lifted her chin. I will not let a girl with quick hands and a borrowed jacket rewrite who we are. Vivian didn't argue. She only waited the way one waits for a gavel. Margaret's voice, when it came, was low and final. She will never be admitted into this family. Not by rumor, not by pity, and certainly not by my son's impulse. She drew a breath, as if sealing a letter. Whatever it takes, Vivian. Whatever it takes, Vivian echoed, rising. I'll start with breakfast calls. Footsteps approached in the corridor, hushed, hurried. The door opened a careful hand's width, and Clara's niece, one of the younger maids, peeked in, cheeks flushed with a message too big for her uniform. Ma'am, she whispered, eyes darting between them. Forgive me, the phones. They haven't stopped. Mrs. Ashby's calling Mrs. Harrell, and the paper rang twice. Folks say there were cameras tonight, she swallowed. They're already talking. Margaret did not move. The maid's words fell into the quiet like small stones into deep water. What are they saying? Vivian asked, though she already knew. That Mr. Daniel put his coat on the waitress, the girl managed, and that you, ma'am. She stopped, mortified. Thank you, Margaret said, crisp but not cruel. Tell the switchboard no more calls tonight. The maid slipped away. Vivian reached for her clutch. It begins, she said. Nej, Margaret answered, turning down the lamp until the room was more shadow than shape. It has already begun. In the hall beyond, the grandfather clock chimed a soft count, marking off a night that would stretch longer than most. Outside, beyond the hedges and the ironwork and the long drive to the street, Charleston's porches glowed with late lamps as neighbors bent to whisper news from the Everett gala, news that, by morning, would not belong to the household anymore, but to the whole town. And so the first rumor took its breath, and the city breathed with it. By mid-morning, Charleston buzzed like a market stall with no closing hour. The story from the Everett Gala left the gates of the estate and found legs of its own, crossing porches, drifting through church foyers, catching rides on delivery trucks and streetcars. Filks repeated it with the certainty of people who hadn't been there but wished they had. The matriarch's temper, the torn uniform, the young heir stepping in, a jacket placed over a girl who poured wine for a living. At the corner cafe on Meeting Street, the barista tamped espresso while 2 women in linen discussed the servant with a spine. One clucked her tongue. Bless her heart, she looked so composed, they say, almost like she practiced. A man in a seersucker suit, pretending not to listen, murmured into his phone, Ambition, that's what it smells like. He didn't bother to tip. Across town at the open-air market, under awnings that kept out almost as much sun as they let in, vendors piled tomatoes beside okra and peaches. A fishmonger wrapped paper around a red snapper and told his regular, "Cameras were there, you know what that means. Tomorrow it'll be scripture." The regular laughed, then lowered his voice. "He covered her shoulders? That's chivalry, or foolishness." By the time the snapper reached the ice chest, the sentence had turned into, "He's fallen headlong," and then a stall later, "She's drawing him in." Junior League tea room, Vivian Caldwell stirred sugar into a glass of iced tea with the quiet rhythm of someone who knew exactly how rumors took shape. She did not push. She only allowed certain words to drift, composure, audacity, out of her depth, like mint leaves, so the brew would carry the right flavor. She praised the girls' presence, and those who wanted scandal heard performance. Graduated didn't take long for the story to reach the rooms where money listens with a careful ear. In the conference suite on the top floor of Everett Holdings, the board gathered around a long table the color of old bourbon. The windows looked out over steeples and palmetto fronds, the harbor shining like a promise. Inside, the air grew tighter with each polite preface. Mr. Lanier cleared his throat first. He had a voice built for Rotary clubs and budget votes. "Daniel, we're fond of you, but investors are skittish by nature. They prefer a quiet hand on the tiller." "Stability," Mrs. Duvall added, smoothing her pearls. "We are all for kindness. No one blames a gentleman for lending a jacket, but the paper's early edition mentions a waitress by name. That invites a narrative." Jaw sat straightened, the table as if to show he wasn't hiding anything. "We operate in steel, shipping, and community grants," he said evenly, "not in gossip." "Backstage becomes reputation," Mr. Lanier replied, as if reciting policy. "Reputation becomes cost of capital." Flushing. Another member, younger and eager to prove he belonged, leaned in. "We need to understand direction of travel, Daniel. Are you—" He hesitated, pretending to search for a softer word than the one he'd chosen. "Planning to marry a waitress?" Shelv's silence jumped like a fish in a flat pond. Daniel's ears burned, but his voice held. "I'm planning to run this company with integrity. I won't measure a person's worth by a uniform." "That is admirable," Mrs. Duvall said, "and also beside the point. Perceptions move markets. Clients ask questions. Foundations hesitate. If your personal life invites turbulence, we must consider safeguards." "What kind of safeguards?" Daniel asked. "The kind that keep distance between you and the story," Mr. Lanier said, "at least until the tide recedes. Decline public appearances that stir curiosity. Reassure the papers. And perhaps," he chose his words as if placing crystal, "reassign staff who complicate matters." "Reassign," Daniel repeated, tasting the euphemism. He thought of a pair of frightened hands gripping torn cloth, a silver pendant catching chandelier light, a face that refused to crumple. "No," he said quietly, "not as a sacrifice to convenience." "That sounds noble," the younger man said, until the quarterly call. Positor stood, not rudely, but with finality. "Our balance sheet is strong because we've asked more of ourselves than the city asked of us. I'll keep it that way." Meeting adjourned. He didn't wait for a second to the motion. As the door shut behind him, the room buzzed again, lower now, less courteous. Down on the street, the city kept talking. A deacon on a church step told his brother-in-law, "The boy needs counsel." A hairdresser told her noon appointment, "That girl's got fire. I don't blame him." By dusk, two versions of Grace existed side by side, the employee who had been treated poorly, and the climber bold enough to take a man's coat as a rung on a ladder. Which version survived depended on whose porch swing you were sitting on. Grace kept her head down and worked. The kitchen clattered with pans and the warm smell of butter and garlic. When she could, she slipped into the pantry to catch a breath that didn't smell like heat. The pendant lay cool against her skin. She pressed it without thinking and thought of her mother's voice. "Keep your dignity when they wish you'd lose it." When her shift ended, she used the service door, stepping into evening air that held a hint of salt. The staff lockers were tucked in a narrow hall that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. Inside her cubby, a small envelope waited, plain, no stamp, the flap tucked but not sealed. Her name was written in careful block letters. Ombies. She hesitated, then pulled the slip free. The note was short, each line tight as if the writer feared the letters might betray them. Disregard here. Take the hint as a message meant to bruise. For a moment, Grace stood very still, the hallway quiet except for the hum of a vending machine. Her fingers wanted to crumple the paper, but she smoothed it instead, as if her own steadiness could iron out someone else's spite. In the glass of a framed notice, she caught her reflection. Tired eyes, hair pulled back. Daniel's jacket long since returned to the coat room, the pendant a small circle of light. He folded then slid it into her pocket. Outside, the cicadas had begun their evening hymn. The city would keep talking, that was what cities did. But Grace knew there were only two voices that mattered now, the one inside her that insisted on her worth, and the one waiting to see whether Daniel's quiet promise in a loud room would hold when the room turned on him. Blindness her, a door clicked. Someone's footsteps paused, then moved on. She let the sound pass through her and walked out toward the alley, toward the thin slice of sky that still held a trace of pink, telling herself that a uniform could be mended and a name could be cleaned. But a heart had to be guarded, especially when the whispers were the loudest thing in town. The Caldwell house glowed like a lantern as twilight settled over the live oaks. Lamps warmed the long piazza. Inside, crystal chimed and low laughter moved like a current. Vivian's parties always looked effortless, the way a snare looks like ribbon. Grace arrived on Daniel's arm in a blue dress the color of tidewater. Simple, careful, chosen to offend no one. She had let the seamstress at a neighborhood shop take in the waist and raise the neckline. "Wear your shoulders like you belong to yourself," the woman had said, and Grace tried. Daniel's hand was steady at her elbow, though she felt the weight he carried in the quiet of his grip. "Thank you for coming," he whispered at the door. "We keep living our lives, that's all." Inside, polished floors reflected chandeliers, a quartet softened old tunes, and trays of shrimp and grits in porcelain spoons floated past. Vivian met them at the threshold of the drawing room, flawless in pale gold. "What a lovely shade," she said, eyes resting a second too long on the blue. "So brave." Her smile suggested a compliment. Her tone filed it down. Grace answered with a gentle nod. "Thank you for having us." She kept her gaze level and moved where Daniel led, through clusters of donors and committee chairs. She could feel their eyes, the way people watch a newcomer enter the pews they've sat in for years. A woman near the mantel leaned toward her husband. "The color is striking," she said softly, "but not Charleston." Another murmured, "It photographs loud." Someone else, not meaning to be overheard, offered, "Sweet girl, perhaps, but this is a room of satin rules." Grace let the music be her shield. She asked an older gentleman about his garden. She laughed lightly with the museum docent about a portrait hung slightly off-center. It was the sort of small talk that oils a room. Still, every few minutes, she caught a whisper turn its head toward her, as if called by name. Redhead glided past them more than once, arranging conversations the way florists set stems, this one beside that one, a thorn angled just so. She placed a trustee who had scolded Daniel that morning within earshot, edged a reporter near the bar, drifted Mrs. Duval to a window where the blue would read brightest in lamplight. When Daniel stepped aside to confer with a board member, 2 minutes he promised, Grace crossed to a side table for a glass of water. A small square of linen lay half-tucked beneath the vase. She would not have noticed it if the corner hadn't shown embroidery. 2 letters stitched in navy thread, D.E. Her throat went dry. Daniel Everett. The cloth was fine, the monogram discreet, the sort of handkerchief his father might have ordered by the dozen. For a breath she considered turning away, letting it sit where it lay. But her hand moved of its own sense of tidiness. She pinched it by one edge to set it aside. "Oh!" A voice brightened just beside her. "Is that his?" A ripple of attention gathered itself. "How romantic," someone said, as if it were a scene from a play. Grace laid the handkerchief carefully on the table and drew her fingers back. "It must have fallen," she said. "I'll see that it's returned." "Or staged," a man at the bar murmured, as if to his glass. Props help a story travel. A younger woman in a pearl headband leaned in, curiosity shining. Did he give that to you at the gala? I read he covered your shoulders. The pearl headband turned into a pearl laugh. Now a token. How cinematic. Across the room, Vivian's voice drifted, feather light. No, no, we mustn't speculate. I'm sure it's innocent. She paused just long enough, though she does have a way of finding the spotlight. Grace felt heat climb her neck but kept her face calm. Mr. Everett's belongings are Mr. Everett's business, she said quietly, to no one in particular. Excuse me. She meant to take the cloth to the coat room to remove the piece from the stage where it did not belong, but as she reached, a gentleman, one of the club's secretaries, had already scooped it up between two fingers with a delicate flourish. I'll return it, he said, meaning, I will enjoy the errand. And then the sound began. Not loud, not crude, just the gentle saw of genteel people cutting. She placed it there. She wanted it seen. This is how girls make ladders. The word planned floated once, twice, then settled, as if the room had been waiting for it. Daniel rejoined her, saw the ring of faces, the unease moving like a shadowfish beneath their expressions. What happened? He asked, low. Knee that can't be cleaned, she answered, and though she kept her tone even, he heard the effort in it. A handkerchief appeared. He understood at once. My initials? She nodded. I didn't. That's not the point. They stood a moment in the center of it, and he placed his palm at the small of her back, a quiet anchor. We'll leave soon, he murmured. Vivian materialized with the ease of a host whose feet know every floorboard. Leaving so early? She asked, surprise as pretty as a bow. Do stay for the thank you toast. People might talk if you vanish. Let them, Daniel said, and for a flicker Vivian's eyes sharpened, then smoothed. Before they could move, an older woman stepped out from near the portrait of some Caldwell ancestor. She wore navy silk and carried herself like a captain who had seen all kinds of weather. Miss Hart, isn't it? She said to Grace. Yes, ma'am. I'm Helen Brooks, the woman said, offering a hand. We met once at the hospital fundraiser. You refilled my coffee when the urn misbehaved. Grace remembered the laugh that had followed that small mishap, warm and unembarrassed. I did, she said, surprised by the kindness arriving in the middle of the room. Helen's gaze traveled the circle, then returned to Grace. Blue suits you, she said, plain as bread. Don't let anyone convince you it doesn't. A hush settled, not because the sentence was remarkable, but because it landed without apology. A person like Helen Brooks did not waste words, and people noticed when she used them. Vivian smiled as if delighted. How gracious, Helen. Not gracious, Helen said mildly. Accurate. She shifted, and her voice dropped for Grace alone. Walk with me a moment. They stepped toward the French doors that opened to the piazza. Outside, the night was soft and salt-sweet. Crickets stitched their hymn along the hedges. Helen rested her hands on the rail. You don't know me, but I was a girl once in this town. Good family, wrong address. It took me years to understand that some doorways are built to make you doubt your feet. Grace exhaled, the breath she'd been holding since the linen square appeared. I didn't touch that cloth to show it, she said. I touched it to tidy the room. I know, Helen answered. And believe me, those who aim this sort of thing at you know it too. They simply prefer a narrative that keeps the world as they arranged it. She paused. They're moving from whispers to props. That means they're not satisfied with bruising your name. They want to make your courage look like theater. Grace looked back through the glass at the bright room, at Vivian's fixed grace, at Daniel standing alone for the first time that night. How do I answer what I can't prove? With conduct, Helen said, and with care. Don't give them a loose thread to pull, but hear me, child. Her voice softened into something like kinship. This is only the first stitch. They will sew until the seam splits. The Fennec's fingers found the pendant at her throat. She rubbed the edge of it like a coin people carry for luck. So this is the beginning, she said. half to herself, and kind at once. "Only the beginning," she said, "and you'd best steady yourself for what comes after." By late afternoon, its own weather, cool, amber, and quiet. Sunlight slid through the tall windows in long, slanting panes, catching the dust the way a hymn catches breath. Shelves climbed to a coffered ceiling. A brass lamp ticked as it warmed. Here, the house remembered how to be civilized. Grace had come only to shelve a stack of ledgers and to steady herself. Helen Brooks's voice had followed her since the night before. They're moving from whispers to props. Don't give them a loose thread to pull. She set the books where the spine lettering lined up in a tidy row, then stood a moment with her palm on the wood, letting the smoothness cool her. "Miss Hart." She turned. Preston Hale had the kind of handsome that photographs well and weathers poorly. He stood in the doorway with his jacket unbuttoned and his smile arranged. "Forgive the intrusion. I was told I might find you here." "Then you were told more than you needed," Grace said, not unkindly. She stepped away from the shelves and kept the broad table between them. "If you're looking for Mr. Everett, he's with the foundation staff." "I'm looking for you." The room as if touring it. "You've stirred up quite a city. Even the club can't decide whether to be scandalized or entertained." He lifted a book at random, glanced at the gilt title, and set it down carefully, as if to prove he meant no harm. "You must be tired." "Of being discussed? Yes." She folded her hands to keep them still. "What is it you want, Mr. Hale?" He watched her a moment, as if weighing which card to show. "To offer sense," he said finally, "and perhaps a measure of shelter." He took one step, not enough to be called improper, but enough that she could smell the faint bite of his cologne. In houses like this, loyalties shift with weather. One day you're draped in a gentleman's jacket, the next you're left to the rain. "I could be a counterweight." His smile narrowed into something meant to be confidential. An ally. Grace thought of the handkerchief at the Caldwells, of eyes that preferred stories to facts. She kept her voice even. "I don't need counterweights. I need truth." "Amused," he echoed. Eepel agreed to say aloud. "Tonight they've agreed on other words." He rested his fingers lightly on the table's edge. Mr. Everett, he's a decent man, but decency bends when shareholders lean on it. When that happens, where will you go? You deserve a door that opens." "You are holding the wrong handle," she said. "Please step back." His eyelids dipped, as if disappointed by her refusal to play. "You misread me. I'm not bargaining, I'm warning. There are people in this town who find it useful to watch you fall. Wouldn't it be better to have one of those people on your side?" He leaned another inch, lowering his voice to the softest register, his words meant to reach her alone and the room at large by rumor. "I can be your ally." She moved, a crisp, precise shift that put the table fully between them again. "No," she said. "You can be a decent guest and leave, Grace." Not given him her first name. The sound of it in his mouth made the air feel smaller. Inge at the far door made its clean, familiar click. Daniel stepped in without ceremony because this was his house and the library had always answered to him. He lifted his head, expecting ledgers and the scent of lemon oil. What he saw instead was a picture that arranged itself before he could stop it. Preston, close enough to be counted, his hand trailing from the polished edge. Grace opposite him, chin raised, pulse visible at her throat. Two people framed by afternoon light, as if a painter had planned the distance. For a half-second, no one spoke. Silence did the work. "Mr. Everett," Preston said smoothly, turning with the speed of a man rehearsed. He put a fraction more space between himself and the table, enough to claim innocence without appearing to retreat. "We were just talking over the week's commotion." He let the last word carry a smile. Daniel looked at Grace. He didn't look at Preston. He already knew what men like Preston looked like. He searched her face for something to hold, a signal that would untie the knot that had cinched since the Caldwell night. She opened her mouth, but he saw the way her fingers touched the pendant, seeking ground, and his own doubt, aggravated by 100 small cuts, moved first. "Did you need something, Hale?" His voice came out level, but not warm. "Only to pay my respects," Preston said. "Miss Hart and I were discussing support." He let the word hang as if it were benefaction. "Your respects are unnecessary," Daniel answered, eyes still on Grace. There was love in them, yes, fierce and unashamed, but braided through it was the same bruise he'd been pressing lately, to see if it still hurt. "This room isn't a parlor for speculation." Preston spread his hands. "Of course." He dipped his head toward Grace with a small, false gallantry. "Another time," he said softly, pitched so that it might be heard as promised by anyone listening from a hall. When he passed Daniel, he paused the way men pause at a chessboard, as if appreciating a piece's position. "You can't hold back a tide with good intentions," he murmured, and was gone. The door closed. The room resumed its breathing, brass ticking, far birds, wind through oak. Grace and Daniel stood with the table, a polished river between them. She spoke first. "He cornered me." "I saw," Daniel said. But what he had seen and what he could unsee were at war. "I walked in and—" He stopped, because finishing the sentence would give the image more life than it deserved. "You walked in at the exact moment he wanted," she said. "They are arranging moments now. That's their new sport." She held his gaze, steady. "I asked him to leave before you came." Nod meant, "I hear you." The nod meant, "I am free of what I felt when I opened the door." "I'm trying, Grace," he said quietly. "Every day I'm trying to keep what we know ahead of what they say. They are counting on that trying to tire you." She folded her hands again, not to hide a tremor, but to keep from reaching for him across a distance that wasn't just wood. "Don't let their tricks teach you a lesson that isn't true." His mouth tightened, the way it does when a man wants to argue with his own fear and won't. "I need to speak with the foundation before the evening call." It was the wrong sentence, and he knew it. He tried again, softer. "I need a little time to quiet this picture." She inclined her head, granting what she did not want to grant. "Then take it, but let the picture be honest." He stepped close. I stepped back. He looked at her a long moment, and the love in his face did not falter. Only the doubt, thin as a hair, stubborn as one, remained threaded through it. "All right," he said. "All right." Stabilize without touching her, because he didn't trust his hands to be neutral. The latch found its seat. The library was itself again. Grace stood where she was, the pendant warm under her fingers, the sun already lowering along the window mullions. The scene would travel faster than any denial she could offer. Faces in town would affix it to what they already preferred to believe. And yet what returned to her, again and again as the light changed, was not Preston's practiced nearness, but Daniel's eyes in that first instant. Love and uncertainty laid side by side like two pages of the same book. Some sights stay. She knew this one would. Under the governor's chandeliers, light poured down like polished water, while schemes kept to the edges. The ballroom had the perfume of magnolia and floor wax. A string quartet softened the air so conversation could glide. Charleston's finest circled the room in tidy orbits, pausing at oyster canapes, weighing one another with smiles that never reached the eyes. Daniel arrived with Grace on his arm. He wore the kind of calm that businessmen use as armor. She wore a deep blue dress that didn't argue with the room, and her mother's pendant rested where pulse meets collarbone. The hush that followed them was brief but sharp, as if the city remembered again that it was being asked to decide something it preferred to whisper about. Margaret spoke with the judge's wife near the dais, all serene compliments and frost beneath. Vivian Caldwell drifted in a different tide, collecting guests with the ease of a woman raised among place cards and pedigrees. When she looked toward Grace, her mouth made a kind line that wasn't kind at all. The evening held, for a while. A donor praised Daniel's latest initiative. A former senator clapped him on the shoulder. Grace stood as one stands during a hymn, quiet, present, steady, offering thanks, greeting those who dared greet her, letting her dignity be her only argument. Margaret watched the way a mother watches a fire inch toward drapes. Vivian chose her moment after the second waltz, when the quartet paused for tuning and the room loosened. She approached with a folded envelope held in two careful fingers, cream paper, a neat crest. "Miss Hart," she said, voice pitched to carry just far enough. "This was found near your chair. I thought it best to return it discreetly." Grace glanced at Daniel. He had been turned by a foundation trustee, and then at the envelope. Her name wasn't on it. Neither was anyone's. She opened it anyway, because refusals become spectacles here faster than acceptance. A single page lay inside, written in a hand that mimicked Daniel's with almost tender malice. The sentences were not long, but they were the kind that grease gossip. "Your light has been a secret I cannot carry any longer. We will find our hour away from the noise." It was addressed not to Grace, not to anyone named, only to you, the pronoun of scandal. At the bottom, a practiced flourish. D. Everett. Vivian's brows knit with pity, the way a bow is tied, perfect and performative. Around them, sound thinned. Someone's bracelet chimed. A waiter stalled mid-step. The letter's edges looked sharper than they were. Grace did not let it tremble in her hands. She folded the page once, then looked up into a circle of faces, waiting to be told what they were seeing. "This," she said, voice steady as a porch step, "is a forgery. I will not bow." The words opened a path. People love certainty almost as much as they love spectacle. Some gasped as if disappointed. Others stood taller, as if given permission to think better thoughts. Daniel was already moving. He reached them before the silence grew teeth. "May I see it?" he asked, and Grace placed the paper in his palm without looking away from Vivian. He read quickly, and then again slower. It was close enough to be the work of someone who had studied not only his signature, but his rhythms. But it wasn't his. He didn't use that turn of phrase. He would never put "we will find our hour" on paper. He saved his vows for breath. "This is not mine," he said, and the room heard the change in his voice, the way certainty firms a sentence. He held the paper as a man holds something that has tried to borrow his name, then tore it once and again, clean, the sound small but final. Whoever brought this into a public room owes this household an apology. Vivian's smile thinned without breaking. "I returned what I found," she said, palms open, as if to show they were empty. "I thought discretion would be kinder than rumor." "Is not need a courier," Grace answered. "It finds its own door." From the edge of the crowd came a polite cough, a shifting of feet, and the quartet, blessed professionals, took that as cue to begin again. The violins lifted, conversations restarted themselves like engines after a stall. Some faces were pleased to be rescued by music. Others were not done looking. Grace turned to Daniel, and for a breath neither spoke. His eyes said what his hands had said to the paper. "I know you. I choose what is true." It was enough to steady the floor beneath her, though the room still tipped with opinion. Margaret had not moved during the commotion. She watched as one watches a seam that ought to have split but didn't. When the music swelled loud enough to give privacy, she leaned toward Vivian without shifting her smile. "We will need something sharper," she murmured. The syllables slow and calm. "A blow that ends the debate." Vivian's gaze stayed on the dancers, as if discussing gowns. "Then we stop playing with paper," she replied softly, "and we make him watch." Rurned as if nothing had happened, as if light could outpace malice. Grace felt Daniel's hands settle at the small of her back, a quiet anchor. The waltz spun up, the city pretended to forget. But along the perimeter, where decisions are made without minutes or motions, two women counted the steps between rumor and ruin and prepared to cross them. Rain came sudden and sure, flattening the garden beds and silvering the oaks beyond the drive. By the time the carriage lamps winked out, the wide stone steps of Everett Estate had turned slick as river rock. Grace stood halfway down, where the downspouts torrent broke into a mist, letting the cold work through her until the last of the ballroom heat had left her skin. The letter had torn in Daniel's hands, cleanly, decisively. Yet the echo of it still hummed in the chambers of her chest like a stubborn note. Water gathered at her lashes and slid free. She did not brush it away. It was easier to let the rain take what it wanted. The starch of fear, the perfume of other people's judgment, the grit left by every whisper. She closed her fingers around the small pendant at her throat, her mother's, feeling the familiar nick in the gold where the clasp had once caught. When she was a child, that flaw had seemed a wound. Tonight it felt like proof. Something can be marred and still be precious. The door opened behind her with the soft thump of a well-oiled hinge. Helen Brooks stepped out with a shawl draped over one arm and an umbrella tipped forward like a blessing. "You'll catch a chill, child," she said, though the word child carried respect rather than condescension. She eased the shawl around Grace's shoulders and lifted the umbrella so the rain made a gentle drum instead of a knife's edge. "I needed the quiet," Grace murmured. "There's quiet, and then there's punishment," Helen replied. "No sense doing their work for them." They stood together watching the driveway shine. Somewhere down the lane a horn sounded once, short and lonely. The kitchen windows cast warm rectangles onto the herb beds, and Grace thought of the many nights she had wiped those panes clear of steam. The way parsley smells like clean earth when you crush it between your fingers. "People will keep talking," Helen said after a time. "That's their occupation, same as ours is to put supper on a table and a roof over it. But talk is a weather. It passes. What you are, that's the house." She angled the umbrella so the drops slid in tidy lines. "Don't let them redraft your blueprints." Minimize laugh startled out of Grace, tender and hoarse. "They've tried. King, they'll keep trying. The world keeps a ledger, and it's mighty careless about where it puts its commas. Truth keeps a longer book." Helen's voice softened. "Your mother knew that. She wore it like you wear that pendant." Grace's fingers tightened. "I still hear her sometimes," she said, embarrassed by the confession, even as it warmed her. Not words exactly. More like the way she would stand when the wind pushed at her, the way she'd plant her feet and make the wind go around. Helen nodded. Stance says more than speeches. They watched the rain thin to a steadier fall. Grace pulled the shawl closer and felt the weight of the evening rearrange itself inside her. She pictured the ballroom again, the chandeliers serene, Vivian's hand as delicate as a surgeon's when she delivered her poison, and let the anger pass through her like a tide that recedes without stealing the sand. "They can tar my name," she said at last, voice low but even. "They can throw mud until their hands are stained, but they can't rewrite what is true." That's the spine of it. Helen's approval was quiet and entire. "You keep that spine, the rest can bend without breaking." Rella and set its spokes humming. Helen steadied it. "You're not alone, Grace. Don't dare believe that you are. Men and women who've scrubbed these floors and set those tables, folks who never once got their names printed in a program, some of them are praying for you while they peel potatoes. Not because you're perfect, because you're standing up straight." Grace blinked hard. Kindness could hurt more than cruelty when it found you tired. "Thank you," she said, and meant the two small words as a pledge. They climbed the steps together, the stone darkening underfoot, the brass rail cool beneath Grace's palm. At the landing, Helen paused. "When my James passed, the church ladies brought more casseroles than anybody needs," she said, a smile in the memory. "But it was one old neighbor who saved me. She said, 'Eat what you can today, freeze the rest. Tomorrow we'll ask again.' That's how this is. Tonight you eat what courage you can. Tomorrow we'll ask again." Inside, the foyer smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. Their wet steps made dull prints on the checkerboard floor. From the corridor came the murmur of voices, the soft clink of china being set to rights. The estate swallowed sound in the practiced way of houses built to keep secrets. They had nearly reached the back stair when Margaret appeared at the head of the main one, framed by polished banisters and the portrait of an Everett ancestor who seemed perpetually mid-judgment. She was composed to the last hairpin, as if the rain could not find her. Vivian hovered a step behind, her expression as neutral as a ledger page. Margaret's gaze took in the umbrella, the shawl, the damp hem of Grace's dress, and returned to the face she had already decided she would not permit to belong. "Miss Hart," she said, voice carrying without effort, "as head of this family's philanthropic arm, I expect proper representation at the Everett Foundation Gala." Hand stilled where it touched Grace's elbow. Margaret continued, polite as a summons. "You will attend. It is important that the city see we are magnanimous." The faintest turn of her mouth suggested any other interpretation one wished to adopt. Her eyes slid to Daniel's closed study door, then back. "Mrs. Brooks, see to suitable attire." Vivian's lashes dipped. She did not speak. She didn't need to. The statement had done what statements of power always do. It offered a chair and dared you to wonder if it was a trap. Grace felt the shawl's warmth and the pendant's cool. She lifted her chin, not in defiance but in recognition. A line had been drawn, and she had been invited to stand upon it. "Yes, ma'am," she said, each syllable clean. "I'll be ready." Margaret inclined her head as if a transaction had cleared, then drifted away, leaving the citrus scent of her perfume and the faintest ripple of satisfaction in her wake. When she was gone, Helen exhaled, a breath she'd held for too long. "There it is," she whispered. Mailers answered without looking away from the empty stair. "There it is," she said, and tightened her grip on the necklace as if setting an anchor for the days to come. Charleston buzzed like a beehive. At the corner grocer, on church steps, in barbershops, the question rolled from mouth to mouth. Would the maid dare show up at the gala? Grace heard it even in her tiny room off a narrow street where the paint peeled like old bark. Mrs. Jenkins knocked with a tin of warm cornbread and a look that could steady a ship. "Honey, you hold your head up," the widow said, easing herself onto the edge of the bed. "You're the pride of this block. We've watched you work honest, and that's a richer cloth than silk." Missy hovered at the door, cap in his hands. "If they clap or they don't, Miss Grace, we're clapping for you." Their small kindness stitched something back together inside her. She set the tin on the table and smoothed the shawl Helen had loaned her. The room felt larger. Near dusk, Daniel came by, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. He reached for words and found only a tangle. "I need time," he said, as if time lived in his pocket. Grace searched his face, then shook her head gently. "Time is what we don't have," she whispered, "not when truth is being traded by the hour." He had no answer. From the hill where Everett Estate crowned the oaks, a string quartet began to tune. The notes drifted down like bright birds, and the street seemed to hold its breath. Grace rose, fastened her mother's pendant, and stood. The night that would test them had started. The chandeliers blazed like small suns, casting a buttery glow across crystal and silver. A string quartet lifted a familiar waltz, and the talk of Charleston's benefactors moved in even currents. Pledges murmured, names compared, hands shaken. Grace stepped into the great hall on Daniel's arm, the sapphire dress Helen had altered falling in a clean line, her mother's pendant tucked warm against her skin. She felt the room tighten around her, not unlike a ribbon drawn too snug. Courtesy on the surface, judgment underneath. "Is that the girl?" Someone breathed near the donor wall. Bold to show her face. Another answered. Or brave. Grace kept her eyes on the program, letting the notes fill the spaces where nerves might slip in. Daniel's hand was steady at her elbow, yet she sensed the weight he carried, the board, the family name, the eyes that added everything and everyone to a ledger. Wildfires drifted toward them as if moved by music, pale gold silk whispering. "Welcome," she said sweetly, lifting a flute of red to her lips. Then, in one polished motion, she pivoted, let her wrist tilt, and the wine leapt like a stroke of paint, blooming across her own bodice. "Oh," her voice cut through the quartet. Bows faltered. "Grace, you must watch yourself." Heads turned, stares landed. Grace reached into the tray a server held and offered a linen napkin. "Let me help," she said, even unflustered. Vivian accepted with a delicate sigh meant for an audience. Such a pity. This silk stains so easily. Ickened. There it is again. Always a scene. Someone near the stage tutted. Another clucked about standards. In the middle of the room, Margaret stepped forward, time bending around the authority in her posture. The conductor lowered his bow. Conversations thinned to a hush. "This evening is for the Everett Foundation, our hospitals, our scholarships, our promises to this city," Margaret began, voice clear as a bell. "Yet we find ourselves, once more, pulled toward disruption." She let her gaze rest briefly on Grace. "Good works require dignity. They require steadiness. We cannot invite disgrace into our house and expect our work to remain untouched." Deadliest. Even the ice in the highball glasses seemed to listen. Grace stood without dropping her chin. She did not argue. She would not beg. The pendant rose and fell at her breath. Around the edge of the crowd, the question traveled like a spark. What will Daniel say? The space beside Grace seemed to brighten with expectation. He looked from his mother's composed face to the dark fan of wine on Vivian's silk, then to Grace. Quiet, straight-backed, rain still remembered in the sheen of her hair. The room held its breath for his answer. Daniel said nothing. The quartet found its bow again, but the melody rang thin as glass. Daniel kept his gaze on the floorboards, jaw tight, hands useless at his sides. Around them, donors resumed their murmur as if politeness could sponge away what had been said. Grace felt the heat rise in her face and forced her shoulders back. The pendant at her throat ticked like a small clock. Abeshoai turned to him, not to the crowd. "Your silence is the weapon they use," she said, voice low enough to be decent and clear enough to carry. "Not their lies. This." A tremor ran through her, quick as a shiver, then vanished. She would not let them see anything more. Helen had appeared at the edge of the circle, a shawl folded over her arm, pleading with her eyes. "Child, breathe." Grace shook her head gently. Popcorn, she stepped away from Daniel without touching him. The doors to the terrace gave, and nighttime air rushed in, damp and close. Rain had begun again, a fine, steady fall that silvered the steps. She did not lift her skirt. She walked out into it as if stepping into a baptism, each drop rinsing off a word she didn't deserve. The doorman hesitated, then let the door ease shut behind her. Daniel did not follow. He stood as though nailed where he'd been placed, a man counting costs he could not afford to tally aloud. Helen moved to him, stopped, then turned after Grace with the shawl. Knee behind them, Margaret's profile softened into satisfaction. She leaned toward Vivian, the corners of her mouth barely moving. "She won't return," she murmured, and reached for another glass as the music swelled, bright and hollow. The storm had passed, leaving the estate wrapped in a heavy hush. Behind the grand house, the ancient oak stretched its limbs against a clearing sky, drops still sliding down its bark like silent tears. Grace sat at its roots, damp hem curled around her shoes, her fingers tight on the small pendant her mother had left her. She pressed it into her palm until it marked her skin, as if pain could anchor her when dignity felt so close to slipping. Helen's steps were soft in the wet grass. She carried a lantern that threw a golden circle over Grace's bowed head. For a moment she said nothing, only lowered herself onto the bench carved into the oak's roots. "Your mother sat here once," Helen whispered, after Margaret cut her down with the same tongue. She wept until she was emptied. I swore I'd never see it happen again. Grace lifted her eyes, raw but steady. They will not erase me as they erased her. If I fall, I will fall standing. The words came with a trembling breath, but landed like iron. Helen reached for her hand, pressing it around the pendant. Then let that be your shield, child. From the house, a bell tolled faintly. News was moving fast. By dawn, word would spread. Everett Foundation would hold a press conference, one that would decide more than legacy. It would decide whether Grace's fight had only begun. In the dim light of her narrow apartment, the walls still damp from last night's rain, Grace found a small stack of envelopes slipped under her door. Their paper was cheap, some written in uneven hands, but each carried a warmth no ballroom could ever give. She unfolded one, Mrs. Jenkins' careful script. They may take away your name in their circles, child, but here you are ours. Reputation fades, but trust among neighbors does not. Grace pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes stinging not from shame but from gratitude. More followed, short notes from shopkeepers, from mothers who had seen her carry groceries for them without asking, from old men who remembered her smile in the mornings. Every word was a thread stitching her torn dignity back together. Wildfires bounded in from the hallway, his shoes muddy, his grin wide. He held out his own folded scrap. "You're the pride of this block, Miss Grace," he said with all the gravity his young voice could hold. "They can't take that from you." Knelt, drawing him close and whispered, "Then I'll carry your faith like armor." Strength coursed back through her veins, not borrowed from wealth but from those who had nothing yet gave everything. Across town, in a parlor gilded with mirrors, Vivian listened as a servant delivered the news. Her smile thinned. "So," she murmured, "the girl still refuses to buy." Morning light poured through the tall windows of Everett Estate, painting the long mahogany table in gold. Yet the faces around it were carved in stone. The board members, men and women who held the family's wealth in their hands, spoke with clipped voices. "Daniel," one said firmly, "the city will not wait. Investors are restless. Either you sever ties with that waitress, or we withdraw our support." Like a gavel strike, Margaret sat at the head of the table, her posture regal, her eyes gleaming with victory. Vivian, poised at her side, added softly, "The choice is obvious, Daniel. Family legacy cannot survive her shadow." Daniel's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. His gaze swept the table, the sharp suits, the watchful eyes, the weight of generations pressing down on him. For a heartbeat, he saw Grace's face instead, her defiance beneath the chandeliers, her voice trembling, yet unbroken. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. His lips parted, but no declaration came. Only a whisper to himself, too low for anyone to catch but him. "If I lose everything, what will I have left?" And with that, the room held its breath, waiting for a man torn between duty and love to choose which world would shatter. The hall was packed, chandeliers blazing above rows of polished chairs, cameras blinking like restless eyes. At the podium, Margaret's voice rang with icy poise. "This family has carried a proud legacy for generations, yet shame clings to us now, brought by a woman who does not belong." Plelled, pens scratched, flashes burst. Grace felt every gaze sear into her, but she stepped forward, steady. Taking the microphone, she let silence settle before speaking. "I am not my mother. I am the truth of her, born from the shadows you cast." Her voice was clear, cutting through the hall like a bell. Vivian sharp and cruel. "What a performance. Do you plan to audition for the stage next?" Grace met her eyes, calm but unyielding. Those who have never known dignity mistake it for theater. But dignity cannot be staged. It must be lived. The hall hushed. Reporters froze, pins suspended midair. And then all eyes turned as one toward Daniel, waiting for his answer, his silence now heavier than any verdict. Daniel rose slowly from his seat, the scrape of his chair echoing louder than any voice. The hall stilled as he walked to the podium, his eyes sweeping the sea of expectant faces before landing on Grace. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying across the room with a force that silenced the whispers. "I will not let this charade go on. I choose Grace." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed furiously. Daniel continued, his jaw set. "The forged letters, the stage scandals, the whispers, they were never hers. They were weapons, wielded by those too afraid of her strength." He turned, facing Margaret and Vivian directly. "And I will no longer be complicit in your cruelty." Margaret's face drained of color, her regal composure faltering. Vivian tried to protest, her words sharp but trembling. The press murmured wildly, pens scratching, flashes exploding like lightning. Daniel stepped down, reaching for Grace's hand. His voice, softer now but resolute, filled the charged silence. "From this day forward, there will be no more silence between us." But in that moment, only the two of them seemed to exist, united against the storm. The morning sun filtered softly through the branches of the old oak in the Everett garden. Dew clung to the grass, sparkling like scattered diamonds. Grace stood beneath the wide arms of the tree, her necklace warm against her palm. Daniel stepped beside her, his hand finding hers. "I will not leave you again," he said quietly, the weight of his silence from nights past replaced by a steady promise. Grace searched his face, and for the first time, she saw no hesitation.
From the path came the sound of familiar laughter. Mrs. Jenkins arrived with a small basket, Tommy skipping at her side. "We thought you could use a bit of sweetness after so much bitterness," the older woman said, offering fresh pastries wrapped in cloth. Grace's eyes welled, not from sadness, but from the quiet strength of community. She touched the chain at her throat, whispering, "Mother, they could not erase me." The sun broke fully, bathing her in light. Grace stood tall, Daniel at her side, the city still divided, but she remained unshaken, a woman who had endured the storm and emerged in the morning's glow. Sometimes the storms we face in life are not about the lies others spread, but about the silence we allow. Grace's journey reminds us that dignity is not granted by wealth or titles. It is proven when you choose to stand tall, even when the world tries to bend you.
And maybe that's the question we should all ask ourselves. When faced with doubt or injustice, will we remain silent, or will we speak with courage, even if our voice trembles? Because in the end, silence can wound deeper than words, but truth carried with integrity will always find the light. Strength is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to rise, even when fear whispers louder. If this story made you reflect, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're with me. Tell me, what state are you watching this from? I'd love to hear. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next one.